There is a new player that's going after an ETF, but they're doing it in kind of an uncertain way. We're going to dive into that today. My name is Paul Barron. Welcome back to TechPath. Joining me is, of course, Mr. Alex Dodenhoff. Great to have you.
Great to be here. Thank you very much.
All right, so let's jump into it. Alex, today, first is the market. Let's go over to CoinGecko. Market cap currently setting up a little bit, 3.5%, $2.2 trillion. We're going to hit the 2.3 mark, I think, today. That's a big one.
I think we're on the way, and people are watching it, so are we.
Yeah, 127 billion in trading volume, and of course, Bitcoin's sliding market cap dominance at 40.5%. So if you look at where the market has been going, and all of what I think in terms of retail investors that look at where would I enter? If I look at people that I know in my own circle, they still have not jumped onto Bitcoin because they haven't seen an ETF come into play. They haven't seen major players on that. Are you seeing that in the circles you run in?
In the circles I run in,
No,
I have to
they're all
say,
in.
they're not institutional. So among those that I see, maybe we'd like to see Bitcoin options, more liquidity there. But as far as ETFs go, the circles I run in, they're okay with logging on to KuCoin or a DEX to make that happen. Even wrapped Bitcoin. I mean, these guys are deep into it.
I like it. Well, for the main retail investors, because this is going to be one of those things that drives the marketplace in a big way, is once we see an ETF jump in, and this first story, just to kind of jump to this one, this of course is Fidelity lobbying the SEC to approve Bitcoin's ETF in a private meeting. A private meeting with the SEC? Who gets that kind of meeting?
Not the retail investors. I don't think so.
Multinational financial services firm Fidelity Investment basically has pressed the U.S. Securities Exchange to approve its Bitcoin exchange traded fund. This one kind of came out of nowhere because you look at Van Eck, you look at Wood. I mean, there's been so many players that are in the list to get a Bitcoin ETF. Do you think Fidelity could kind of jump the line here?
That's a great question. It does come down to is it going to be a singular entity that pushes the SEC over the edge, or is it this chorus of more institutional players coming together to push the SEC? Of course, more likely, the greater the number of voices, the greater the likelihood of it happening. So what I like to see is just more headlines like this. Replace Fidelity with who you will, but the more headlines, I think, the closer we're getting.
Yeah, I think when we've looked at this a couple times, Grayscale, I still felt like Grayscale had a little bit of an inside track on it. And at the same time, Cathie Wood, but we've got some news here on that, might have an inside track on it. And then Fidelity kind of comes out of the blue and is working some different angles here with these private meetings. I think maybe because, back to your point, is that we're dealing with institutional players that have a lot of deep connections in these organizations like the SEC, hence you can get a private meeting, and that could make the move.
I have to wonder what effect retail investors that are taking their funds off of Fidelity because they're interested in increasing their crypto exposure is eating away at Fidelity's bottom line.
Listen, so we have the Diamond Circle, you guys know about it. We have a group of big investors and teams of people that invest heavily in crypto and the space of blockchain in a big way. And in that group, full disclosure, we've seen a lot, and I'll say in the hundreds of millions, moving off of traditional securities exchange traded funding houses like a TD Ameritrade, Fidelity, et cetera, and moving into the crypto space. So to your point, definitely, I like it, Alex.
I'm one of those individuals, I have to say. I actually took everything I have off of Fidelity and onto places where I could get that crypto exposure. And Robinhood, of course, is straddling the two. So I would think that Robinhood is faring these waters better.
Yeah, they get, funny thing, it's a funny story, when I got into Robinhood, which is just a little while ago, my guys here in the studio have been begging me to get onto Robinhood for a long time.
Sure.
But buying, crypto on Robinhood because they don't have a wallet, I know that's coming maybe, still one of those scenarios. But back to your point, Fidelity, TD Ameritrade, Schwab, you name the house, this could be a survival mode for some of these guys because they could be seeing major movement in these actions to kind of really take investors out of the play.
Absolutely, and I wonder what effect ultimately we'll see on the number of entities that actually opt for an ICO as opposed to an IPO.
Right.
And that's something that's probably on their horizon for not this year necessarily to eat away at the number of IPOs that we see in the pipeline, but in the next 5 years, should we imagine more are going to skirt around the typical channels? That could be a worry of theirs.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the case. Back to this story, it says, in response, SEC Chair Gary Gensler comments last month on the possibility of reviewing only BTC futures products. Fidelity urged that strict adherence to either the 1933 law allowing stock exchanges to list the products or allowing futures-only products was no longer necessary because the market has matured.
Right, and what was the Bitcoin price in 1933? All that to say that we are still referencing, practically archaic laws that are on the books now may go to show that a reckoning is due for the SEC's treatment of these new securities.
Yeah, so much so that you have basically one of the biggest, baddest, I think, investment houses out there, and that is Cathie Wood, saying, wait a minute, maybe we take our ARK funds, would just give itself a little clearance to buy some Canadian Bitcoin ETFs. Let's jump the pond, or not the pond, but let's jump the line, go over to the Great White North and say, let's get into the ETFs up there, because Canada, of course, has moved into active ETFs for
Absolutely.
Bitcoin.
And that's just not a tenable long-term position for U.S. investors to be relying on products from outside of the U.S. So it is, once again, high time that the SEC bows to the interest of essentially the masses whose money perhaps is flowing through these institutional players, and therefore the pressure is on.
I think it's a cool tandem 1-2 punch for the SEC and a potential ETF and how it might launch. First, Fidelity comes in and says, wait a minute, old school, not new school. And we need to be first in line because we're kind of the structured guys over here. We have the biggest play in the market. We're going to help the most retail investors. That's what the SEC is supposed to protect. And then you have Cathie coming in and saying, listen, I'm kind of done waiting on you guys. We're heading up north.
Absolutely. And back, that notion that the SEC is there to protect retail investors when retail investors, once again, are this chorus of those who are preferring crypto at least as part of their portfolio. So the SEC is, at very least we can say doing a poor job of being on the, forefront of retail investor interest, which perhaps was never the intended use of the SEC, to be on the forefront of virtually anything, but to lag behind is perhaps something that we shouldn't tolerate much longer.
Yeah, this was one last note that happened on this story, and this I think is a little bit of a tell on how close, because Cathie, of course, and I think a lot of these major investment houses, they're close enough to what's happening at the SEC to kind of get a little bit of a forethought of where are we in the decision-making process. But their next generation internet ETF prospectus now includes reference to Canadian Bitcoin funds.
Right.
So does that maybe give a little bit of a leading indicator to investors inside of the Wood House that is saying, maybe this is going to be longer than we think. We need to let our investors move into the Canadian ETFs.
I think that's a very valid reservation to have, that this is an inconvenience at the moment, that they are having to jump the border literally for the exposure that they're looking for. But ultimately, I think the tides of change are simply just too powerful, and inevitability will essentially prevail, and that is that these Bitcoin ETFs will find their way onto U.S. exchanges. I think there is no future without them, although we are, of course, going through this rocky moment where, as you said, investors will have to contend with the landscape.
Last point here, the prospectus later listed the Canadian ETF as an example of a pooled investment vehicle, ARKW, which may invest in it. The ETF already invests in Bitcoin indirectly through the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, which has been one that they've been moving. That's a 5.52 weight in its worth, which is $313 million. That's no slouch in your portfolio.
Right.
And of course, they come in with mainly inflation hedge type projects. But the one thing that happened on a conference, the SAL conference here, Anthony Scaramucci's conference, was when Wood dropped the $500,000 price point for Bitcoin by 2026 in 5 years.
Right.
She's on a race. She is on a race to figure out how to get her investors into this asset.
Right.
SEC, get out of the way, or let somebody lead the pack at least to start setting precedents so these other houses can start developing them.
We're seeing similar, I would call it, faith coming from the likes of BlackRock CEO and others who are saying, Bitcoin is not going to go away essentially for any time. And if it's not going away, we know what it does. It tends to rise in value. So to ignore it is leaving a great opportunity cost on your balance sheet that eventually will no longer be a tenable position either.
Yeah, you don't want to be in the position of Fidelity where they are right now, where they're playing defense.
Right.
Some of these investment houses are really in a good position to play offense and get in early, really start scooping up a lot of that investment capital. And there's a lot of money on the sidelines right now, dry powder, waiting for an entry point that's a safe entry. An ETF would be one of them, for sure. Yep.
And while Bitcoin finds itself in this range, I think that dry powder is there to stay until that moment when it's not, and we see a nice run up at the end of this third mega cycle that Bitcoin tends to go through. So I think there's something to monitor in a nice parabolic move soon.
It's coming. It's coming. I feel it. It's in the air, man. It's like the fall. It's like football season or something. It's in the air, man. I love it. Anyway, you guys are listening in over here on the podcast right now. Hopefully the audio sounds amazing. A little ASMR. Listen in on the podcast now. But wait, go to the YouTube channel. That's where you can actually see some of the charts, talk to us, drop some comments below, and of course find out all the cool things that are happening here on TechPath. If you have an idea for a show, shoot it to us, which is just producer@reverendnetworks.com, or hit me up on Twitter @PaulBaron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.